Alright, these are your notes for section 4.6, and 4.6 deals with two types of triangles, isosceles triangles and equilateral triangles. This first video is going to talk about isosceles triangles. So let's recap a little bit. An isosceles triangle is a triangle that has two congruent sides. Alright, only two congruent sides. If it has three congruent sides, it's an equilateral triangle. So if it has two sides that are the same or that are equal, then it's an isosceles triangle. Now there's several different parts to an isosceles triangle. We're going to go over those also. First part to an isosceles triangle are the legs. And the legs are the two congruent sides. Alright? So, in our picture, let's look at this first triangle here. These would be our congruent sides, and we would mark them. So those would be the legs. Okay? The base is the non-congruent side, or the third side. So our base is down here. Okay? The vertex angle is the angle where the legs meet, where they come together. Okay? So our vertex angle is here. Now, it won't always be at the top of the triangle. One way to think of it is that it's across from the base. So it may be to the left, it may be to the right, but it's always across from the base. It's where the two legs come together. It's where the two legs meet. The base angles are the two angles that touch the base. Okay, and they're in a pair. There's a pair of them. They're the other two. So our base angles are these two where I have the stars. Base angles. Okay? So those are the four parts to an isosceles triangle, and I'll go over them again in this other triangle here. We have the legs, which are the two congruent sides. The base is the third side. The vertex angle is where the two legs meet. It's across from the base. And then the base angles are the other two angles, and they have to touch the base. Okay? Notice that they are down here at the bottom. Both angles share that base. They share that base. It's the same for both. One side of the angle is the base for both of them. Okay? So those are the parts of an isosceles triangle. Now we have two big ideas, and these are important big ideas, and they're only specific to isosceles triangles. Okay? So big idea number one. If a triangle has two congruent sides, then the angles across from them are also congruent. Okay? So that's the big idea. Notice we have two congruent sides marked, so the angles across from these are going to be congruent also. Now, what that really means, that's a lot of words there. What that really means is if you have an isosceles triangle, your base angles are congruent. That's the big idea. So if you know two sides, if you have an isosceles triangle where two sides are congruent, then the angles opposite those, because remember your vertex angle is at the top, your angles opposite those sides, which would be the base angles, are going to be congruent also. Big idea number two is the converse of that. Okay? It says if a triangle has two congruent angles, then the sides opposite or across from them are congruent. What that means is just the opposite. My arrows are going to go the opposite directions. I started with congruent angles this time, so now the sides across from those angles are going to be congruent. Okay? So it's the same idea. If you have two congruent angles, then you automatically know it's an isosceles triangle. That's the big idea here. Two congruent angles means an isosceles triangle. Okay, that's the idea. So big idea number one, if you have an isosceles triangle, then your base angles are congruent. Big idea number two, if you have two congruent angles, then you have an isosceles triangle. Then your sides are going to be congruent. So now we've got two examples we're going to do. This first one deals with expressions where in the directions say to determine the value of x. So we've got our triangle here. Notice it's isosceles. We know because the two sides are marked congruent. Now, according to our theorem, or our big idea, sorry, which is a theorem, it's got a special name. I've put it in simpler terms so that you can understand it. A theorem is pretty lengthy, so go with what we've written down up here. It's big idea number one. If we look at big idea number one, if we have two congruent sides, then we know the angles are congruent. If we know things are congruent, then we can set things equal. Because they're congruent. Okay? Big idea right there. Anytime you have things that are congruent, we can always set them equal because they have to be the same. Now again, the reason that those angles are congruent is from big idea number one. We know that the two sides are congruent, so the angles across from those sides are congruent. So now we're going to set these equal. 2x plus 24 equals 4x minus 6, and we're going to solve it like we normally would. Let's subtract 2x from both sides. Now you could have subtracted 4x. I subtracted 2x because I want my x to stay positive. 24 equals 2x minus 6. Add 6 to both sides. 24 plus 6 is 30. Equals 2x. Divide by 2. So x is 15. And we've answered the question. The question does not ask us for what the angles are. It asks us for what x is. So we can stop here. We don't have to plug it back in. And that's one example of using these ideas, these big ideas we have for isosceles triangles. Our second example is a little different. We've done examples like this before. It says find the measures of the numbered angles. And they gave us one angle to start with. They tell us that this angle is 35. Notice, though, that we have two isosceles triangles here. Two isosceles triangles in the picture. We've got triangle 1 and triangle 2. Alright? Angles 1 and 2 are in triangle 1, and angles 3 and 4 are in triangle 2. Now we're going to use those big ideas we talked about, for isosceles triangles to solve this type of problem. We've done something like this before where we find the numbered angles, and I told you that it's always best to start with angle 1 and work your way through. You may have to jump around a little later, but it's best to start with angle 1. So let's start with angle 1. Let's figure out what it is. Well, we know that two sides are congruent, which means these two angles are going to be congruent. That's big idea number one. If I have an isosceles triangle, then my base angles are congruent. So that means angle 1 is 35 degrees. And the reason I'm going to say is that base angles are congruent. Big idea number one. Okay? That one's really important. Now to find angle number 2, there's 180 degrees in a triangle. Alright? 180 degrees in a triangle. I know that two of the angles are 35, so to find the third one, we would do 35 plus 35, that's 70, and then 180 minus 70 is 110. Okay, so that's how we would get angle 2. Angle 2 is 110 degrees. That's an idea we talked about in a different earlier section. So these ideas are going to be building on each other. You have to continue to remember them. They'll keep coming back. To find angle 3, we're going to look in triangle 2. Okay, 3 and 4 deal with triangle 2. Triangle 2. To get angle 3, though, we're going to use angle 2. If we know that what this angle here is, the starred angle, then angles 3 and that star are going to be congruent because we have an isosceles triangle. That's big idea number 1. So to get the star, we would do 180 minus 110. The reason we do that is that they're supplementary. They make a straight line. Supplementary. So the starred angle is 70 degrees, which means angle 3 is 70 degrees. That's, again, big idea number 1. The base angles are going to be congruent in an isosceles triangle. Now to find angle 4, we're going to do the same thing we did to find angle 2. It's a triangle. There's 180 degrees in a triangle. So we would add 70 plus 70, because that's what the starred angle and 3 are. That gives us 140. Do 180 minus 140. That gives us 40 degrees. So angle 4 is 40 degrees. Now, if you're confused, you think you got the wrong answer, you can always go back and check. To check, remember you add all the angles in the triangle and it should equal 180. That's how we would do an example like this. Both types will be on your homework. You'll also have some types where the sides are congruent in an isosceles triangle. We've done this before. Sides in an isosceles triangle, and this is just something you should remember. You set them equal. The reason you set them equal is that they're congruent. Alright? That's big idea number 2. So if I gave you 2 angles that were the same, you could set the 2 sides equal, because then you'd have an isosceles triangle. We didn't do an example like that, but that's something that you should remember. Okay? Well, those are your notes on isosceles triangles from section 4.6. If you have any questions, rewatch the video. Make sure you know big ideas number 1 and 2. And then if you still have any questions, bring them to class next time.